Chapter 1. The gunfight on Main Street. The furniture hit the dirt with a dull thud. A wooden chair, a child's rag doll, a tin wash basin, everything that made a house a home, now piled in the mud outside a company shack in Matewan, West Virginia. It was May 19th, 1920, and Mary Chambers stood on what used to be her porch, watching two men in black suits empty her life onto the ground. Her husband was underground, 3 miles deep in the mine, shoveling coal in darkness. He didn't know that while he worked, strangers were throwing his children's beds out the door. Mary's youngest, a girl of 4, clung to her skirt and asked in a small voice, "Mama, where are we going to sleep tonight?" Mary didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. The men in suits were detectives from the Baldwin-Felts agency, a private army hired by coal companies to handle problems. And in the spring of 1920, the biggest problem facing the coal operators of southern West Virginia was a single, dangerous word: union. Matewan wasn't supposed to be the kind of place where history happened. It was a narrow strip of a town, squeezed between steep, forested hills and a muddy railroad track that carried coal out and company men in. The main street was barely wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. Wooden storefronts leaned against each other like tired men. The air smelled like coal dust, wet wood, and the greasy smoke from the train depot. Everything here belonged to the coal companies. The mines, the houses, the store where miners bought their food with company scrip instead of real money. If you worked in the mines, you lived in a company house. If you complained, you didn't just lose your job, you lost your home the same day. The system was simple and brutal. Keep your head down, dig coal, die young, and don't ask questions. But by 1920, the miners were done keeping their heads down. They had watched friends die in cave-ins and explosions. They had breathed coal dust until their lungs turned black. They had worked 12-hour shifts for $2 a day while the company owners grew rich enough to build mansions in Charleston. And now, quietly, carefully, they were signing union cards. The United Mine Workers of America had been trying to organize southern West Virginia for years, and the coal operators had crushed every attempt. They fired union men, hired spies, and sent Baldwin-Felts detectives to break up meetings with fists and guns. But Matewan was different. In Matewan, the miners had an ally who wore a badge and wasn't afraid to use it. Sid Hatfield didn't look like a hero. He was 27 years old, stocky and broad-shouldered, with a round face and a flat cap that never seemed to sit quite right on his head. He had grown up poor in the coal camps, the son of a miner who died underground when Sid was a boy. He knew what it meant to go to bed hungry. He knew what it felt like to watch your father leave for a shift and wonder if he'd come home. When Sid became Matewan's police chief in 1919, the coal companies assumed he'd be like every other local lawman, easy to buy, easy to control. They were wrong. Sid Hatfield had something the coal operators couldn't pay for and couldn't break: a stubborn, bone-deep hatred of bullies. When union organizers moved through town in the spring of 1920, signing up miners by the dozen, Sid didn't stop them. When the coal companies demanded he arrest union men for disturbing the peace, Sid told them to go to hell. And when Baldwin-Felts detectives came to town on May 19th with eviction orders, Sid decided he'd had enough. There were 13 of them. 13 Baldwin-Felts men stepped off the morning train at Matewan, dressed in dark suits and fedoras, rifles and pistols hidden under their coats. Leading them were 2 brothers with a reputation that reached across the coalfields: Albert and Lee Felts. The Felts brothers weren't just detectives, they were enforcers, the kind of men coal companies called when they wanted a problem solved with violence. Albert was cold and methodical. Lee was the one who enjoyed the work. Their job that day was simple: serve eviction notices to union families, throw them out of their homes, and make sure every miner in southern West Virginia got the message. Join the union, and you lose everything. They started on the outskirts of town, at the rows of identical company houses where miners' families lived. The process was efficient. Knock on the door, read the eviction notice, Wait exactly 60 seconds. If the family hadn't started packing, the detectives went inside and threw their belongings out themselves. Mattresses landed in the mud, dishes shattered. Photographs of dead relatives, the only things some families owned that mattered, were tossed into piles like trash. One woman, 8 months pregnant, begged for more time. "My husband's working a double shift. Please, just wait until he comes home." Lee Felts looked at her with empty eyes and said, "You got 60 seconds, lady. Use them." When Mary Chambers tried to pick up her daughter's doll from the mud, one of the detectives kicked it further into the street. "Leave it," he said. "You won't need toys where you're going." Mary stared at him, memorizing his face, the cruel twist of his mouth, the way he stood like he owned the world. She would remember that face when the shooting started. By noon, 6 families had been evicted, and by noon, every miner in Matewan knew the Baldwin-Felts men were in town. Sid Hatfield was in the hardware store when he heard. He was buying nails, ordinary, stupid nails, when a boy ran in, breathless and wild-eyed. "Chief, they're throwing people out. Baldwin-Felts is here. They got guns. They're—" Sid dropped the nails on the counter. He didn't run. He walked, slow, deliberate, back to his office, where he kept a Winchester rifle and 2 Colt revolvers. He checked the cylinders, loaded the rifle, and buckled his gun belt. Then he went to find Mayor Cabell Testament. By late afternoon, the Baldwin-Felts men were done. They walked back toward the train depot, their work finished, ready to leave on the evening train. They were laughing. One of them was smoking a cigar, the smoke trailing behind him in the still air. They didn't notice at first that the street had gone quiet. Miners stood in doorways, leaning against storefronts, watching with hard, silent faces. And waiting at the depot, arms crossed, badge gleaming in the fading sunlight, was Sid Hatfield. Standing beside him was Mayor Testament, an older man with silver hair and a nervous expression. Albert Felts saw them and smiled, thin, cold, condescending. "Afternoon, Chief. Didn't know you'd come to see us off." Sid's voice was calm, but his hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "I'm not here to see you off, Albert. I'm here to arrest you." The street went dead silent. Albert Felts laughed. "On what charge?" "Illegal evictions. You got no warrant from this county, and you got no right to throw folks out of their homes. We've got papers signed by a judge in Logan County. That's all the authority we need." "Logan County ain't this county," Sid said quietly, "and you're in my town." Lee Felts stepped forward, his hand moving toward his coat. "Careful, Chief. You arrest us, you'll be arresting every detective from here to Charleston by next week. You really want that kind of trouble?" Sid tilted his head, almost smiled. "Lee, I've been poor my whole life. Trouble's the only thing I ever had for free." For a moment, no one moved. The man with the cigar took one last drag, then flicked it into the dirt. It rolled across the street, still smouldering, leaving a thin trail of smoke. Then someone, later, no one could say who, pulled a trigger. The first shot cracked like thunder in the narrow street. Suddenly the air was full of gunfire. Bullets punched through wood, shattered windows, ricocheted off the train tracks with high singing whines. Miners fired from alleys, doorways, second-story windows, rifles and shotguns and pistols they'd carried to work for years in case of trouble. The Baldwin-Felts men fired back, trapped in the open, diving behind barrels and storefronts, shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar of gunfire. Sid Hatfield stood in the middle of Main Street, both revolvers drawn, firing methodically, calmly, as if he were at target practice. Lee Felts went down first, shot through the chest, collapsing against the train depot wall, blood spreading across his white shirt like spilled ink. Albert Felts tried to run, stumbling toward the train, and took a bullet in the back. He fell face first into the mud, his expensive suit ruined, his fedora rolling away into the gutter. Mayor Testament, caught in the crossfire, fell to his knees, clutching his stomach, his face pale with shock. Someone screamed. The man who'd been smoking the cigar lay sprawled in the dirt, his eyes open and empty, the cigar still burning a few feet away in a puddle of his own blood. The shooting lasted less than 3 minutes. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in everyone's ears faded, 7 Baldwin-Felts detectives lay dead or dying on Matewan's main street. 3 townspeople were dead, including Mayor Testaman. Sid Hatfield stood in the middle of the carnage, his revolvers still smoking, his face unreadable. Behind him, in the doorway of a boarded-up shop, Mary Chambers held her daughter close and watched. She looked at the bodies of the men in suits. She thought about her furniture piled in the mud. She thought about the detective who'd kicked her daughter's doll into the street. And for the first time in years, Mary Chambers allowed herself to hope. News of the Matewan Massacre spread through the coalfields like wildfire. In mining camps 50 miles away, men gathered around newspapers and whispered the story to each other in the dark. They heard that a small town had stood up to the coal companies, that a handful of miners had faced down the feared Baldwin-Felts detectives, and won. They heard the name Sid Hatfield, and it became something more than a name. It became a symbol. Resistance was possible. For the coal operators, Matewan was a nightmare and a warning. They had sent 13 men to crush a union. 7 came back in coffins. Somewhere in a Charleston office, a coal executive picked up a telephone and made a call. "We need more men," he said quietly. "A lot more men." For the miners of West Virginia, Matewan was a spark. And in the hills and hollows, in the dark tunnels underground, a dangerous idea began to spread. If one town could fight back, maybe an entire region could do the same. Sid Hatfield went home that night, cleaned his revolvers, and sat on his porch in the darkness. He knew what was coming. He'd killed powerful men, embarrassed powerful companies, and shown the miners of West Virginia that the system could bleed. They would come for him. And when they did, it wouldn't be 13 detectives on a train. It would be an army. The powder keg had been lit. What came next would be bigger than a street corner gunfight. It would be thousands of armed miners marching through the mountains. It would be bombs falling from airplanes on American soil. It would be the largest armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. And it all started with a little girl asking her mama where they were going to sleep, and a man with a badge who decided he'd had enough. Chapter 2. The March of 10,000. Sid Hatfield became a wanted man before the bodies were cold. Within 24 hours of the Matewan Massacre, the coal operators had mobilized their lawyers, their politicians, and their newspapers. By the end of the week, Sid and 22 other men were indicted for murder. The trial was held in a county courthouse 60 miles away, in a town where the coal companies owned the judge, the jury, and the building itself. Everyone knew what the verdict would be before the trial even started, except it didn't go that way. In the summer of 1921, after weeks of testimony, the jury, 12 coal country men who knew exactly what Baldwin-Felts detectives did to mining families, came back with their decision, not guilty. All charges dropped. When Sid Hatfield walked out of that courthouse a free man, miners erupted in celebration. They gathered in the streets, cheering, firing rifles into the air, singing Union songs. For one brief shining moment, it felt like victory. It felt like the coal companies could be beaten. Sid stood on the courthouse steps, grinning, shaking hands. He probably didn't notice the 2 men in suits watching him from across the street. Charles Lively and C.E. Salter, Baldwin-Felts agents. They weren't there to arrest him. They were there to remember his face. 3 days later, on August 1st, 1921, Sid Hatfield and his friend Ed Chambers traveled to the town of Welch for another court appearance. It was a minor charge, something about property damage, another harassment tactic from the coal companies. Sid wasn't worried. He'd just beaten a murder charge. This was nothing. Both men arrived unarmed. They'd been instructed that weapons weren't allowed in the courthouse. They climbed the stone steps of the McDowell County Courthouse with their wives beside them, Sid's wife Jessie and Ed's wife Sally. It was a bright, hot morning. The courthouse loomed above them. Grey stone, tall windows, the kind of building designed to make you feel small. They were halfway up the steps when the men appeared. Charles Lively stepped out from the courthouse entrance, flanked by several other Baldwin-Felts agents. For a split second, nobody moved. Sid's hand instinctively went to his hip, where his gun usually was, and found nothing. Then Lively and the others drew their pistols and opened fire. Sid was hit in the arm first, then 3 or 4 times in the chest. He collapsed on the stone steps, his body crumpling, blood spreading across the grey stone. He died instantly. Ed Chambers tried to run. They shot him in the back, and as he fell, Sally threw herself over him, screaming, trying to shield him with her own body. One of the agents, later identified as Charles Lively, walked up and shot Ed Chambers in the head at point-blank range. Sally was still covering him when the bullet went through. Jessie Hatfield knelt beside Sid's body, her dress soaking up his blood, her screams echoing off the courthouse walls. The Baldwin-Felts men calmly holstered their weapons and walked into the courthouse. They surrendered to the sheriff. They would later claim self-defense. None of them would be convicted. The news hit the coalfields like a shockwave. In mining camps across southern West Virginia, men stopped working mid-shift when they heard. Some threw down their tools and walked out of the mines. Others stood in stunned silence, fists clenched, unable to speak. Sid Hatfield wasn't just a police chief. He was proof that an ordinary man could stand up to the coal companies and survive. He was the miner who'd beaten them at Matewan, who'd walked free from their rigged trial, who'd shown that resistance was possible. And now he was dead, murdered on courthouse steps, unarmed, in broad daylight, in front of his wife. The message from the coal operators was brutally clear. You can win in court, you can win in the streets, but we will kill you anyway. There is no escape. But the message the miners received was different. They're afraid of us. They had to murder him because they couldn't break him any other way. In a tent camp outside Charleston, a young miner named Philip found out about Sid's death from a newspaper someone had brought from town. Philip was 24 years old, the father of twin daughters who were 3 years old. He'd been working underground since he was 14. He'd joined the union 6 months earlier, secretly, terrified of being fired. When his wife found out, she'd cried for an hour, begging him to tear up the card, convinced the company would throw them out of their house. Now Philip sat on a wooden crate outside his tent, the newspaper trembling in his coal-stained hands, staring at the headline, Hatfield slain. His friend Thomas, older by 15 years, sat down beside him. You see it? Philip nodded, unable to speak. They killed him, Phil. Shot him down like a dog. Philip's voice came out hoarse. What are we supposed to do now? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, We're supposed to finish what he started. On August 7th, 1921, the leaders of United Mine Workers District 17 called a mass rally in Charleston. Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, veterans of mine wars, strike organizers, men who'd spent their entire adult lives fighting coal companies, stood before a crowd of thousands. Keeney was the president of District 17, 40 years old, thin and wiry, with a face carved by decades underground. Mooney was his secretary-treasurer, calmer and more methodical, but just as committed. They'd both been fighting for union recognition in southern West Virginia for over a decade. They'd seen strikes broken, organizers beaten, families evicted, but they'd never seen rage like this. Brothers and sisters, Keeney's voice carried across the crowd. Sid Hatfield is dead. Ed Chambers is dead, murdered by the same men they beat at Matewan. The crowd roared, a sound like distant thunder. We went to the governor. We presented our demands. We asked, begged, for justice, for protection, for the law to do its job. He paused. And what did we get? Nothing. Someone in the crowd shouted, They killed Sid. Another voice, We got to do something. Keeney raised his hand. We are going to do something. We're going to march to Logan County. We're going to free our brothers who've been jailed on false charges. We're going to drive out Chafin and his deputies, and we're going to show the coal operators that we will not be broken." The crowd exploded. Within hours, miners began leaving Charleston, heading south toward the small town of Marmot, 20 miles away. That's where the army would gather. Philip arrived at Marmot on August 20th with his rifle, an old Springfield he'd bought from a veteran for $10, and 60 rounds of ammunition. He'd left his wife and daughters with her parents in a camp 5 miles north. Before he left, his wife had held his face in her hands and whispered, "Promise me you'll come back." He'd promised. But standing at Len's Creek, looking at the hundreds, then thousands, of men arriving with rifles, packs, and red bandanas, Philip wondered if it was a promise he could keep. The miners came from every camp in southern West Virginia, black and white, immigrants from Italy, Hungary, Poland, native-born Appalachians whose families had mined coal for generations. They wore denim overalls, patched work shirts, flat caps. Some wore military uniforms, veterans of the Great War who'd fought in France just 3 years earlier, and every single one tied a red bandana around their neck. It was how they'd recognize each other in the forests, in the chaos of whatever was coming. The press would later call them the Redneck Army. By August 24th, there were an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 armed miners gathered at Len's Creek. It was the largest armed gathering of American civilians since the Civil War. Leading them was a 28-year-old miner named Bill Blizzard. Blizzard didn't look like a general. He was short, compact, with a round face and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a schoolteacher than a revolutionary. But he had a gift for organization. His mother, Sarah Blizzard, was a legendary Union activist who'd recruited him during the 1912 to 1913 Cabin Creek strike. He'd learned from her that anger without structure was just noise. Blizzard divided the miners into units based on which camps they came from. He assigned captains, many of them great war veterans who knew how to move large groups and coordinate fire. He organized supply lines. Volunteers brought food, ammunition, medical supplies. Women like Isabella Riggs prepared hundreds of meals each day in makeshift kitchens. Volunteer nurses wearing hats marked UMW set up a field hospital in a tent. In less than a week, Blizzard had transformed a mob of furious miners into something resembling an army. Philip found himself assigned to a unit of 40 men from Cabin Creek, most of whom he'd never met. Their captain was a man named Hayes, 35, quiet, with a scar running down his left cheek from a mine accident. Hayes had served in France. He didn't talk about it much, but when he gave orders, men listened. On the night of August 23rd, Hayes gathered their unit around a small fire. "Tomorrow we march," he said simply. "Our goal is Logan County. We're going to free the miners Chafin's got locked up, and we're going to unionize those camps." Someone asked, "What if Chafin's men try to stop us?" Hayes looked at him. "Then we go through them." The next morning, August 24th, 1921, the Redneck Army began to move. 10,000 men, maybe more, stretched out in a column that snaked through the forests and dirt roads for miles. They carried American flags alongside their rifles. They weren't traitors, they insisted. They were American workers demanding their rights. As they marched, they sang Union songs. Children from nearby towns ran alongside the column, waving. Women brought out water, bread, whatever they had. One old woman stood on her porch and wept as they passed, whispering, "God bless you, boys." Philip marched in the middle of his unit, rifle on his shoulder, red bandana around his neck. His feet hurt. His back ached from the pack. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Like maybe, just maybe, things could actually change. Ahead of them, in Logan County, Sheriff Don Chafin was preparing for war. Chafin was a big man, over 6 feet tall, with cold eyes and no illusions about who paid his salary. The Logan County Coal Operators Association had been funding him for years. When word reached him that 10,000 armed miners were marching toward his county, he didn't panic. He made phone calls to the coal companies. "Send money. to Baldwin-Felts. Send men. To local businessmen. Arm yourselves. Within days, Chafin had assembled nearly 3,000 deputies, mine guards, and volunteers. He called them the Logan Defenders. They dug in along a 15-mile ridgeline called Blair Mountain. Trenches, machine gun nests, fortified positions. Chafin stood on the ridge, looking north toward where the miners would come. "Let them come," he said to his deputy. "They want a war? We'll give them one." By August 31st, the Redneck Army had reached the base of Blair Mountain. Philip stood with his unit, staring up at the forested ridge rising above them. Somewhere up there, hidden in the trees, Chafin's men were waiting. Captain Hayes walked along the line, checking rifles, giving quiet instructions. When he reached Philip, he stopped. "You scared, son?" Philip thought about lying. Then he nodded. "Yeah." Hayes put a hand on his shoulder. "Good. Means you're smart. Man who's not scared before a fight is either a fool or a liar." He looked up at the mountain. "Just remember why we're here. Remember Sid. Remember your daughters." Philip swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, sir." That evening, as the sun set behind Blair Mountain, throwing long shadows across the valley, Frank Keeney stood with Bill Blizzard at the edge of the camp. "They're up there," Blizzard said quietly. 3,000, maybe more. Machine guns, high ground. Keeney was silent for a long time. Finally he said, "We didn't come this far to turn back." The next morning, August 31st, 1921, the first shots rang out across Blair Mountain. The largest armed uprising in American history had begun, and a young miner named Philip, with a red bandana around his neck and a photograph of his twin daughters in his pocket, climbed the mountain toward the sound of gunfire. Chapter 3. The Battle of Blair Mountain. The first shot was fired at dawn on August 31st, 1921. Nobody could later agree on who pulled the trigger, a miner advancing through the forest or a deputy dug in along the ridge. It didn't matter. Within seconds, the entire mountainside erupted in gunfire. Philip hit the ground as bullets tore through the trees above him, bark and leaves exploding in every direction. The sound was deafening, not individual shots, but a continuous roar, like a thunderstorm that never ended. Captain Hayes was shouting orders, but Philip couldn't hear him over the noise. He pressed himself flat against the earth, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. This wasn't like anything he'd imagined. In his head, a battle had been organized, orderly, lines of men advancing, clear targets, brave charges. This was chaos. All around him, miners scrambled for cover behind trees and rocks. Some fired blindly up the slope, not even sure where the enemy was. Others froze, eyes wide with terror. One man, Philip didn't know his name, stood up to get a better shot and was hit in the shoulder. He went down screaming, clutching the wound, blood seeping between his fingers. Hayes crawled over to Philip, grabbed his shoulder. "Move! We can't stay here!" Philip forced himself to his feet and ran, crouching low, following Hayes and a dozen other men toward a cluster of boulders 50 yards upslope. Bullets whined past him. One hit a tree inches from his head, and he felt splinters sting his face. He dove behind the rocks, gasping for air, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. Welcome to war. The Battle of Blair Mountain would last 5 days. 5 days of continuous fighting across a 15-mile front. 5 days of miners advancing through thick forest, trying to dislodge entrenched defenders who had machine guns, high ground, and endless ammunition supplied by the coal companies. It was the largest armed insurrection in the United States since the Civil War. By the afternoon of the first day, the miners had learned a brutal lesson. Attacking uphill against fortified positions was suicide. Don Chafin's Logan Defenders had spent days preparing. They dug trenches along the ridgeline, set up machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, and stockpiled thousands of rounds of ammunition. Some of the machine guns were water-cooled Brownings, military-grade weapons that could fire continuously for minutes without overheating. When the miners tried to advance in groups, the machine guns cut them down. When they spread out and moved through the forest, Snipers picked them off from concealed positions. It was World War I tactics, transplanted to Appalachia. Philip's unit spent the rest of that first day pinned in the ravine, trading fire with deputies 200 yards upslope. Around 4 p.m., as the sun began to sink behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees, Philip heard a new sound, a distant buzzing, like wasps. Hayes's head snapped up. "Get down! Everyone down!" The buzzing grew louder. Then Philip saw it, a small biplane, circling overhead, dipping low over the treetops. Something tumbled out of the cockpit. It hit the ground 30 yards away with a dull, metallic thud. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then it exploded. The blast wasn't huge, not like artillery, but the sound was sharp and violent, and the air filled with flying metal, nails, bolts, shrapnel tearing through leaves and branches. A man near Philip screamed, clutching his leg where a piece of metal had torn through his pants. Another dove flat, hands over his head, shouting incoherently. Hayes grabbed Philip and dragged him behind a fallen log. "They've got planes. Stay under the canopy. If we move, they'll spot us." The plane made 2 more passes, dropping crude bombs, metal containers packed with explosives and scrap metal. Most didn't detonate, but one landed in the branches above them and went off with a sharp crack, raining debris down on the men below. It was the first time in American history that aircraft had been used in warfare against US citizens on domestic soil. Philip pressed his face into the dirt, his ears ringing, his mind unable to process what was happening. They weren't just fighting other men anymore. They were fighting an enemy with machines, with technology, with resources they couldn't possibly match. By the second day, September 1st, exhaustion was setting in. Philip's hands were blistered from gripping his rifle. His back ached from sleeping on rocks. His ears still rang from the constant gunfire. And they'd barely moved 50 yards up the mountain. That evening, Bill Blizzard called a meeting of the unit captains in a small clearing that served as headquarters. Maps were spread across a plank table lit by kerosene lanterns. Philip wasn't there, but Captain Hayes was. Around the table stood a dozen men, unit leaders, veterans of the Great War, miners who'd spent their lives underground and never imagined they'd be planning military strategy. Blizzard looked exhausted. His glasses were smudged with dirt, his face gaunt. "We're not breaking through," he said bluntly. 3 days of fighting, and we've barely dented their line. They've got the high ground, machine guns, and now planes. A captain named Walter Allen, a big man with a thick beard and a scar across his knuckles, slammed his fist on the table. "We didn't come this far to quit, Bill. Sid died for this. Ed died for this. We turn back now. It was all for nothing." "I'm not saying quit," Blizzard replied. "I'm saying we need to face reality. We're miners, not soldiers. We don't have artillery. We don't have air support. And we're running low on ammunition." Another captain spoke up, a younger man, maybe 30, his voice tight with frustration. "What about reinforcements? What about the Union? Can they send help?" Blizzard shook his head. "The Union's broke, Tommy. We're it. This is all we've got." Hayes leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp. "What about the federal government?" The room went silent. Everyone looked at Blizzard. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. "President Harding's already sent telegrams to the governor. They're mobilizing troops, but not to help us, to stop us." Walter Allen stared at him. "You're saying the army's coming?" "I'm saying if we don't break through soon, we're going to be fighting United States soldiers, men who fought in France same as some of us, fellow Americans." The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Finally, Hayes spoke. "Then what do we do?" Blizzard put his glasses back on and looked around at the tired, dirt-covered faces. "We keep fighting. We hold the line. We push as hard as we can for as long as we can. And we pray something changes before the army gets here." He paused. "Because if the army shows up, this is over." On September 2nd, the third day, Philip's unit was ordered to make a push up the eastern slope of Blair Mountain. The goal was simple: break through a weak point in Chafin's line, and flank the main defensive positions. Hayes gathered the 40 men of his unit in the pre-dawn darkness. Listen up. We're going to move fast and quiet through that gully there. He pointed to a narrow ravine cutting up the slope. Once we're in position, we hit them hard and fast. We punch through, the other units follow, and we roll up their whole line. Someone asked, "What if we can't punch through?" Hayes looked at him. "Then a lot of us aren't coming back." They moved out at 5 a.m., single file, rifles at the ready. The forest was thick, the undergrowth tangled, and every sound seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. Philip was near the middle of the column, his breath coming in short gasps, his hands slick with sweat on the rifle stock. They'd made it about 200 yards up the ravine when the machine gun opened up. The sound was like the world tearing apart. Men dove for cover, screaming, scrambling over each other. Philip threw himself behind a boulder as bullets ripped through the trees, shredding leaves, splintering branches, kicking up dirt in angry geysers. The man in front of him, a miner named Samuel from the same camp, took a bullet in the back. He collapsed forward without a sound, his red bandana bright against the dark earth. Philip stared at that bandana. He'd seen Samuel tie it on that morning, laughing about something, sharing a cigarette with another man. Now Samuel was face down in the dirt, and the red bandana was slowly soaking through with blood. Philip couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Hayes grabbed him by the shirt and dragged him backward. "Fall back! Everyone fall back!" They retreated down the ravine, leaving Samuel's body behind, leaving 3 other men behind. When they finally made it back to their starting position, Philip sat down hard on a fallen log and vomited. Hayes sat beside him, silent, staring at nothing. Out of 40 men, they'd lost 5, and they'd gained exactly nothing. On September 3rd, President Warren G. Harding issued a proclamation. The miners had 12 hours to disperse and return home, or face federal troops. General Billy Mitchell, hero of the Great War, commander of American Air Forces, was placed in charge of the operation. Within 24 hours, 2,500 U.S. Army soldiers, along with bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, were mobilized towards southern West Virginia. Word reached the miners' camp late that evening. Philip was sitting by a fire, trying to clean mud and blood off his rifle, when Hayes came over and sat down heavily beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Hayes said, "It's over." Philip looked up. "What?" "The army's coming. Harding gave us 12 hours. We leave, or we fight the United States government." Philip stared at him, waiting for the rest, for the plan, for the solution. But Hayes just looked into the fire, his face hollow and exhausted. "We can't fight the army, Phil. So we just leave." Hayes nodded slowly. "Yeah, we leave." Philip felt something break inside him. Samuel's still up there, his body's still up there, and we're just leaving. Hayes closed his eyes. "I know. We came here for Sid, for Ed, for all of them, and we're leaving with nothing. I know." Hayes's voice cracked. "I know, son. But if we stay, the army will kill every last one of us, and then it'll really be for nothing." On the morning of September 4th, 1921, the Redneck Army began to withdraw. 10,000 men, maybe more, walked down from Blair Mountain in silence. Some were limping, some were bandaged, some were crying openly, not bothering to hide it. Philip walked with his unit, or what was left of it, 35 men out of 40. His red bandana was stuffed in his pocket, too dirty and blood-stained to wear. As they descended, they passed bodies. Some had been recovered by their units. Others lay where they'd fallen, alone, forgotten, already beginning to bloat in the September heat. One wore a red bandana around his neck. Philip didn't look closely enough to see if it was Samuel. He kept walking. Behind them, on the ridgeline, Don Chafin's deputies stood and watched them go. Some of them cheered. Others just stared, rifles still in hand, making sure the miners didn't change their minds. The battle was over. The coal companies had won. When Philip finally made it home 4 days later, filthy and exhausted, his wife ran out of their tent and threw her arms around him. His twin daughters clung to his legs, crying and laughing at the same time. He held them all, feeling the weight of the rifle still on his shoulder, the hollow ache in his chest where something used to be. His wife pulled back and looked at his face. "Did you win?" Philip closed his eyes. "No." She touched his cheek gently. "Then what did we get?" He thought about Samuel's red bandana soaking through with blood. He thought about Sid Hatfield dying on courthouse steps. He thought about 10,000 men marching into the mountains, believing they could change the world. "I don't know," he whispered. In the end, the Battle of Blair Mountain claimed between 50 and 100 lives. The exact number was never confirmed. Many of the dead were buried in unmarked graves, their families too poor or too frightened to claim the bodies. Over 900 miners were arrested and charged with treason, murder, and conspiracy. Most were eventually acquitted, but the trials dragged on for years, bankrupting families and destroying lives. The United Mine Workers of America was crushed in southern West Virginia. Union membership collapsed. For the next 15 years, the coal operators ruled unchallenged. Don Chafin remained sheriff of Logan County until 1925, paid generously by the coal companies for his service. Charles Lively, the man who shot Sid Hatfield on the courthouse steps, was acquitted and walked free. By every measurable standard, the miners lost. But 50 years later, something unexpected happened. In 1958, Philip, now 61 years old, retired from the mines, living in a small house near Charleston, sat down with a young historian researching the West Virginia mine wars. The historian was nervous, fumbling with a tape recorder, asking careful questions. "Mr. Philip, do you regret going to Blair Mountain?" Philip was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the hills in the distance, hills that still held coal, still held the bones of miners who died underground, still held the memory of a battle most people had forgotten. "Finally," he said, "we didn't win. A lot of good men died for nothing, or what felt like nothing at the time." He paused. "But we showed them we weren't afraid. We showed them that ordinary men, poor men, coal miners, could stand up and fight. And maybe that planted a seed somewhere. Maybe some kid heard the story and thought, if they could do that, maybe I can stand up too." He looked at the historian. "Sometimes that's all you can do. Plant the seed. Let someone else water it." Philip died 4 years later, in 1962. His red bandana, carefully folded, still stained with the dirt and sweat of Blair Mountain, was found in a drawer after his death. His daughters kept it. For decades, the Battle of Blair Mountain was erased from history. The coal companies didn't want people knowing that 10,000 workers had taken up arms. The federal government didn't want people knowing they'd deployed bombers against American citizens. Textbooks ignored it. Historians avoided it. The battlefield itself was left to rot, slowly consumed by forest and time. But the miners who'd been there never forgot. They told their children. Their children told their grandchildren. And slowly, against all odds, the story survived. In the 1930s, when the New Deal gave workers the legal right to organize, when unions spread across American industries, the memory of Blair Mountain was there, buried deep. In the 1960s, when coal miners in Appalachia went on strike again, facing company violence again, they remembered Blair Mountain. Today, historians recognize it as one of the most important labor battles in American history. The ridgeline where it was fought is now threatened by mountaintop removal mining, and activists fight to preserve what's left. Because the story matters. It's a story about 10,000 ordinary people who decided they'd had enough, who marched into the mountains knowing they might not come back, who fought a battle they couldn't win but refused to surrender their dignity. And it all started with a little girl asking her mama where they were going to sleep, a man named Sid Hatfield who wore a badge and wasn't afraid, and a red bandana tied around the neck of a coal miner who believed the world could change. They lost the battle, but the fight continues. Epilogue: The Forgotten War. The trials began in the spring of 1922. Over 900 miners were arrested in the months following Blair Mountain, charged with murder, conspiracy, treason against the state of West Virginia, and insurrection against the United States government. Treason. The same charge leveled against Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. The coal operators wanted blood, and they had the legal system to get it. Bill Blizzard, the young organizer who'd turned 10,000 miners into an army, was arrested on May 15, 1922, and charged with murder and treason. His trial became the most expensive criminal case in West Virginia history up to that point. The prosecution brought in witnesses, deputies, coal company officials, even some miners who'd been coerced or bribed into testifying against their own. They painted Blizzard as a dangerous radical, a revolutionary who'd incited armed insurrection against legitimate authority. The coal operators wanted to make an example of him. This is what happens when you challenge us. The trial lasted weeks. Newspapers across the country covered it. Blizzard sat in the courtroom day after day, a slight man in a wrinkled suit, facing the possibility of hanging. His mother, Sarah Blizzard, the legendary union activist who'd raised him in the movement, sat in the gallery every single day, her face stern and proud. On May 25, 1922, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury came back. Not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Coal operators stormed out in fury. Miners cheered. Bill Blizzard walked out of that courthouse a free man, but he was marked for life. Most of the other miners charged were eventually acquitted or had charges dropped. Juries in coal country, despite intimidation and bribery, refused to convict their own. But the damage was done. The trials bankrupted families. Men lost years of their lives waiting for court dates. The fear, the exhaustion, the constant legal harassment, it broke the back of the union movement in southern West Virginia. By 1923, union membership in the region had collapsed to nearly zero. The coal operators had won after all, not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. Don Chafin remained sheriff of Logan County until 1925. He was paid over $30,000 a year by the Logan County Coal Operators Association, more than 10 times the average miner's salary. He lived comfortably, protected by the same companies he'd defended on Blair Mountain. In 1925, he was finally voted out of office, but he never faced charges for the killings at Blair Mountain. He died in 1954, wealthy and unpunished. Charles Lively, the Baldwin-Felts agent who shot Sid Hatfield on the courthouse steps in front of his wife, was tried for murder. The trial was brief. Lively claimed self-defense, said Hatfield had reached for a weapon. Jessie Hatfield, Sid's widow, testified that her husband had been unarmed, that the shooting was an execution. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Not guilty. Lively walked free and disappeared into history. Jessie Hatfield spent the rest of her life fighting to keep Sid's memory alive, giving interviews, speaking to anyone who would listen. She died in 1976, still telling the story of what happened on those courthouse steps. For decades, the Battle of Blair Mountain was erased. Textbooks didn't mention it. History courses skipped over it. The coal companies made sure of that. They controlled newspapers, politicians, school boards. The last thing they wanted was for future generations to know that 10,000 workers had taken up arms against them. The federal government wasn't eager to talk about it either. Deploying bombers against American citizens, sending the US Army to crush a labor uprising, it didn't fit the narrative of American democracy. So the story was buried. The battlefield itself was left to rot. No markers, no memorials, no acknowledgement that one of the largest battles in American history had been fought there. Trees grew over the trenches. Rain washed away the bloodstains. The forest reclaimed the ridgeline where men had killed each other over the right to organize. Within a generation, most Americans had never heard of Blair Mountain. But in the coal camps of West Virginia, the story survived. Miners told their children. Grandmothers whispered it to grandchildren. Veterans of the battle, those who lived long enough, kept red bandanas tucked away in drawers, silent reminders of a war the world wanted to forget. Then, slowly, something began to change. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the National Industrial Recovery Act, guaranteeing workers the right to organize. In 1935, the Wagner Act made union organizing legally protected. For the first time in American history, workers had the law on their side. The coal miners of West Virginia, the sons and grandsons of the men who'd fought at Blair Mountain, organized again. This time, the coal companies couldn't stop them. By 1940, the United Mine Workers of America had unionized nearly every coal camp in southern West Virginia. The war that had been lost in 1921 was finally won in the 1930s, not with rifles, but with laws, persistence, and the memory of what their fathers had been willing to risk. When old miners signed their union cards in the 1930s, some of them would pull out faded red bandanas and lay them on the table. "This is for Sid," they'd say quietly. "This is for Blair Mountain." The new generation didn't always understand, but they remembered the name. In the 1990s, historians began to rediscover Blair Mountain. Scholars dug through old court records, newspaper archives, oral histories. They interviewed the last surviving children of miners who'd fought in the battle. Slowly, painstakingly, they reconstructed what had happened. In 2009, the battlefield was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. But even that victory was incomplete. Large sections of Blair Mountain had already been destroyed by mountaintop removal mining. The same coal companies that had fought the miners in 1921 were now blasting apart the mountain where the battle had been fought. Activists fought to preserve what was left. Descendants of the miners marched to the site, demanding protection. In 2018, parts of the battlefield were finally designated as protected land. But the fight isn't over. Coal companies still operate in the area. The mountain is still threatened, and many Americans still don't know the story. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Blair Mountain, a memorial service was held on the ridge where the fighting had taken place. Descendants of the miners came from across the country. Historians gave speeches. A monument was unveiled, a simple stone marker with the names of those who died, both miners and deputies. An elderly woman, the granddaughter of a miner who'd fought in the battle, stepped forward and tied a red bandana to the monument. She was 93 years old. Her hands shook as she knotted the fabric. "My grandfather told me this story when I was a little girl," she said, her voice barely audible. "He told me they lost. But he also told me that losing didn't mean it was over. It just meant someone else had to keep fighting." She looked out at the crowd. Young activists, historians, union organizers, descendants. "So keep fighting," she said. "Don't let them forget." The story of Blair Mountain is not a story with a clean ending. It's not a story where the good guys win and justice prevails. It's messier than that. It's a story about ordinary people who stood up against impossible odds and lost. But it's also a story about how that loss planted seeds that grew into the labor rights we have today. The 8-hour workday, workplace safety regulations, the right to organize, the weekend. None of those things were given freely. They were fought for, bled for, died for, by people like Sid Hatfield, by people like the 10,000 miners who marched up Blair Mountain with red bandanas around their necks. And the fight isn't over. Workers still struggle for fair wages, safe conditions, the right to organize without retaliation. The tactics have changed. Fewer rifles, more lawyers, but the fundamental conflict remains the same. Power versus labor, capital versus workers, the few versus the many. Blair Mountain reminds us that this fight is not new. It's been going on for over a century, and it will continue until we decide, as a society, that human dignity matters more than profit. Philip died in 1962, but his red bandana survived. His daughters kept it for decades, carefully folded in a box. In 2019, one of his granddaughters, a woman named Claire who'd never met him, donated it to the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. It's there now, behind glass, faded and stained, a small piece of cloth that once meant everything to a frightened young miner climbing a mountain toward the sound of gunfire. The museum label reads, "Red bandana, worn by coal miner during the Battle of Blair Mountain, August to September 1921. Donated by the family of Philip, last name." Visitors stop and look at it. Some take pictures. Most move on quickly. It's just an old piece of fabric after all. But every now and then, someone stops for a long time. They read the label. They think about what it meant to tie that bandana around your neck, to march into the mountains knowing you might not come back, to fight a battle you'd probably lose because the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. And maybe, just maybe, they think about what they're willing to fight for, what they're willing to risk, what they're willing to stand up against, even if the odds are impossible. That's the legacy of Blair Mountain. Not victory, not a happy ending, but the knowledge that resistance is possible, that ordinary people can fight back, and that even when you lose, the fight matters. The mountain is still there, scarred by mining, threatened by development, slowly being reclaimed by forest. But it's still there. And so is the story, passed down through generations, told in museums, in books, in documentaries, remembered by descendants who never knew their grandfathers, but carry their names and their red bandanas. The Battle of Blair Mountain was the largest armed labor uprising in American history. It was also one of the most forgotten. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The story survived. And as long as people remember, as long as someone ties a red bandana to a monument, or visits a museum, or tells their children about the miners who marched into the mountains, the fight continues.